Hello, my name is Beckett Haight, and today we're going to be talking about what is a learning support case manager. So the scope for today is to talk about what is a case manager, why we call what we do case management, experiences I have had that have led to my current definition, and some examples of things I do as a case manager on the day-to-day. And remember that on the WOVA app, we can ask questions, answer questions, chat a little bit. And while this is airing on December 2nd, 3rd, somewhere around there, it's going to be open for 4 months, and we can communicate through the chat or through the comment section and all that. And we can use it kind of like a little virtual PLN. I don't know if you guys remember those days, but I remember doing those Twitter discussions and networking, and I don't use social media anymore, so I'm going to use this as my social media. But before we get too much into this, I'm curious. I kind of want to have our first discussion question. And the question is, what is your definition of a learning support case manager? So you come to a new school, there's a spreadsheet like this, and they have a column that says case manager. Your head of department says, hey, all of these kids are yours, these 5 kids, or 10. Or 15, or 20, or 30, and you don't know them yet. You're about to be their case manager. Just what does that mean to you? So think about that. So discussion question number 1, what is your definition of a learning support case manager? And if you're in like a watch group, maybe pause the video and you guys can chat about it and kind of just say what that means to you. Or if you're solo, you could maybe just put your answer into the chat so other people can kind of see what people are saying. And if you're watching this solo, I'm just thinking to help you with a little scenario. You're sitting at a restaurant or somewhere like that. You're talking to your friend about your job. You're saying something about case management. You tell them it's 33% of your job. And then they might say, like, what is that? What does that mean? Case management. I've never heard of that. What do you say? My ADHD and oppositional defiance disorder, they started pretty early, but I didn't have my first taste of a case manager for learning support until a few years later. That being said, my conception of case management has been on my mind for X amount of years. I've, I guess I had my first experience getting into having a case manager when I was in 6th grade, and I got kicked out of school for some certain activities, and I was out of school for about 4 months, and then ended up in a non-public school, or an MPS as they're called, a school for students that just have ILPs. They have some type of learning challenge or behavior challenge and whatnot. So yeah, I started off in 6th grade or halfway through 6th grade, had a case manager, got my first IEP. You guys remember when those things were handwritten? Triplicate. My first few years in the game, I had to do that, but things have definitely changed. I used to also have a memo pad and spiral thing in the back of my pocket and a translator in my front pocket. So times are changing. But I was able to get a good medication for my ADHD when I was in rehab when I was about 15, and that helped me turn things around. And I still had a case manager, but now for my learning support pullout class, it was just a regular high school. I was drug-free, and I was in a resource class getting support, mainly with math, to be honest. And then I started volunteering in a class for students with developmental delays soon after I got out of rehab, and I kind of just settled down a little bit. And those volunteer experiences led me to becoming a TA or teacher assistant right after I graduated high school. And I did that part-time on and off for the next 4 or 5 years while I was in college. And I worked with kids with fetal alcohol syndrome, autism, Down syndrome, students with dyslexia and stuff like that in the resource program. And I just got a lot of different experiences. And while I went into college not knowing I was going to be a teacher, I wanted to be a probation officer. I ended up immediately becoming a special educator. And this was my first time being the case manager, no longer deferring to the classroom teacher for decisions, no longer asking if I could call a parent or if I could write a referral or anything like that. It was just me, 23 years old, and coming through leading the ILP team or the IEP team, people looking at me to make decisions. And yeah, that was a big jump from going to college, and I was a lifeguard off and on. I was a teacher assistant, and now I was the teacher. When I moved to Los Angeles, I led the high functioning students with autism program. I had to change my conception of what a case manager was. I had a bunch of students that had different needs. I had multiple teacher assistants. I was co-teaching with a ton of teachers. And basically, I was just fighting for the students to be fully included and, socially, academically, and all that stuff. And my idea of like the ownership of the case really, it kind of took it to the next level during that time. During this time, living in the US, things were pretty bureaucratic and my role was clearly defined. It was written on the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing website, teaching, coordinating services, and generally overseeing the IEP, working with SLPs, like speech language pathologists, OTs, occupational therapists, counselors, school psychs, and like doing behavior support type stuff. That was it. And things were pretty straightforward. Everybody had their lane. My admin for special ed had his lane. We had a bridge coordinator and a head of department, and then you go to the district, and things were pretty clear cut. However, when I took off to the Dominican Republic in 2011 for my first international gig, I found out that while I was working at a strong school, there was a lot more room for doing the things that you wanted to, or your principal wanted to, or the SSD coordinator wanted to. So for example, when I was in Los Angeles, I was the BICM, the Behavior Intervention Case Manager at my school. And I worked with, behavior support. I'm trying to get all the acronyms out of my head. Behavior support plans, FBAs, what's that? Functional behavior assessments, and things like that. And I did what I could at the school. But if things kept escalating and we needed more help, then we had a person in the district called the program specialist. And then so it was out of our hands into the district's hands. But I found that when we were in the Dominican Republic, basically we were the district, right? That's how it works in these international schools. So if I couldn't do it along with, collaborating with the counselor and the principal, that was kind of it. So that's where my idea of case management really got serious, because we had kids that were often getting counseled out of the school, and they were not often. What I should say is we had kids that got counseled out of the school, and there were often kids on my caseload or my colleagues' caseload. So that's an area where I said, oh, I really have to manage this case. It's not just kind of like that very siloed way I was used to, but it was more of the holistic, like whole child. So if it wasn't me working with the tutor that was doing the student's homework, or working with two divorced parents that did everything to spite each other, or to work with the therapist that only spoke Spanish, or I don't know what else we had, the SLP, the OT, we had all these different pieces that we had to tie together, and there was nobody really to keep it all together. And that's where I really took on the advocacy and that mantle of I am a case manager. Because everyone has their role, but if everybody's doing their little piece, who's tying it all together? And my experience, it's the learning support case manager. Is it the counselor? In my experience, they usually have from 100 students on their caseload to, I've seen 600 when I was in Los Angeles. There was a school of 3,000 students, there's 6 counselors. And the counselors are usually looking at the social emotional, they're trying to build relationships with the students. I don't know, like they're working on college, things, transcripts, transition, post-secondary. And I don't see them as necessarily always being that, like, is it the homeroom teacher's job who is teaching content, is grading, has 100+ students, and is doing a lot of other things? Is it fair for them to be managing a behavior support plan? Is it the admin's job? They got a lot of other things to do, dealing with one student when they have 500 students and a lot of different needs. I see that as an area where things could fall through the cracks. So you get the idea. There's a lot of moving pieces, but that leads to my discussion question number 2. If it's not the case manager holding all the moving pieces together, who is? Who can? So if you're at a watch party, this would be a good time to pause the video and talk about this amongst yourselves. I'm kind of curious. I wish I was there. I wish we were doing it live, because either there's debate or everybody agrees and it's like, okay, yeah, we all agree. So I'm kind of curious what people think. And then if you're watching this solo, maybe you can put the answer in the WOVA app, because it'd be great to see. I'll be checking that right now if it's December 2nd or something like that. And then, yeah. So pause the video, take a second, and let's see what's up. For me, with the increasing rates of inclusion, this means that more students are in our schools that, weren't there before. They're in more college prep schools. They're in more IB classes, wanting to be full IB. They want to take AP classes like their friends and just do the whole full program. And I see it as my job to keep the whole case, or the student's academic life, basically, at school going in a positive direction, and just always shooting for the most appropriate challenge. So that's how I see it. If I'm not kind of keeping it all together, the student might not be able to grow as much as they could have. So this is why we see things like in this policy manual from a school in Europe that talks about us being the main family contact, coordinating services, and most importantly, maybe liaising with the whole team at the school and with outside people. We're just holding it all together. It's really nice to see this written in a policy, because some schools I've worked at, it's not so outlined, and it's important to kind of figure out who is holding it down. Otherwise, you might have a situation where the principal's making certain decisions, and then maybe the counselor is working with the teacher, like one teacher, to work on like a little low-key behavior support plan. And then I'm setting up a plan with the school psychologist, and like everybody's doing different things. And if we're not all in sync, then there's a potential for the student not to do their best. Sometimes I wonder if the idea of caseload and case manager is too clinical. I mentioned it to a parent, and I wonder what they're thinking when I say, something like, your child is on my caseload. And sometimes, to be honest, I thought back, like, where does this come from? Why do we use it? And so I did a little research. So the idea of case management has been around for a little over 100 years. And for a long time, people just weren't getting much help. So you were kind of out there on your own, doing your thing. And then slowly we started getting charities popping up, and they were starting to serve, people that had different needs, even up into these days. But then eventually we started holding our governments a little bit more accountable, and slowly government services in different countries. I mean, there's different levels of government support, but we started to see more of that. So like in the 70s, we saw ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In 2004, we saw IDEA, as I call it, or IDEA. What is that? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we started seeing special education being huge parts of budgets for schools. And we saw county services developing, and not just in schools, but just, for a lot of different areas, mental health and other stuff. I mean, not always, some of those things have dipped like in the 80s, and kind of we know about that. But disability services and all of that has really increased over the years. So things have changed tremendously. Nowadays, we see the idea of taking care of people in our communities through the model of case management as being, very important. So we got file cabinets full of files, and we see it in a lot of different professions. So some of the commonalities that we have are nursing. You see case management in nursing, Social work, that's kind of one that's more connected to what we do because we've seen people, at our schools. Like, so I've worked at schools with social workers, and a lot of the kids that I worked with had social workers that they're working with and stuff like that. We got mental health services that have a case management model, and they're kind of doing kind of what we're doing on the day-to-day in a different capacity. Human services, this is maybe picture there's a guy getting out of jail or out of prison. Maybe he has HIV and he's got some needs that are going to be met through some community agency or some government agency. He gets out of jail. He has a caseworker. He needs to see the caseworker. He needs to see his parole agent. He needs to get a bed that night. Like, who's going to help make sure he's not sleeping on the bench that night? Like, there has to be somebody in this situation. It'd be like a human services case manager. So some of the commonalities we continue to see are that in all those situations I just mentioned, there's a person that has a need, along with in learning support or special education. We have to assess their needs. We have to advocate for the needed, the person with needs. And we got to coordinate services. There's legal requirements. I mean, like for us, we have ILPs, we have confidentiality in the psych reports, social work and CPS, mental health confidentiality and all that stuff. And then we also have a lot of documentation, tracking progress, working towards outcomes. That's kind of the key thing. You start with the assessment and you're working towards outcomes, your progress monitoring. So that's how I see a big connection between other case management and what we're doing on the day-to-day in special education or learning support or whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, all of these fields are working with people with a need that has been identified by some assessment and need, like blood pressure, schizophrenia, houselessness. They got scores on a WISC, Connors, BASC, and then we are building plans, setting goals, tracking progress, working with a team to support, and trying to get them basically, to an area of equity or to a baseline, or maybe not from the baseline, but you know what I'm saying. We're trying to just get them to a point where they're living their best life and getting the most support they can. Okay, it's time for discussion question number 3. Is there a difference between a learning support teacher and a case manager? So take a minute to pause this and think about the answer. If you're at a watch party, you guys can chat. And this one, I think it might be less cut and dry. I could see more debate with this one. And also, if you guys want to add it to the app, to the WOVA app, this is another one I'm kind of curious what people have to say. And I'll pop in and throw my answers down. Like I mentioned before, sometimes saying the word case manager sounds a little bit weird when I say it to somebody, like a parent or kind of like a newer teacher. And then it makes me wonder, what's the difference between a learning support teacher and a case manager? But to me, it just boils down to case management and what that represents. Someone could tell me that they're a learning support teacher, and in my mind, I'm just thinking like push and support. I'm thinking, like pull out, working on reading, working on writing. But when they mention case manager, when I think of case manager, I'm thinking of all those things I just mentioned, but I'm also thinking of all those things that we don't see that we do every day. The things that your evaluator or your administrator doesn't see. And, they do an eval, they pop into your classroom, they see you do a 5-point lesson plan. They're like, hey, you're doing good. But you're like, hey, 33% of my job is case management. 20% of my job is case management. Like, how am I doing with that? And that's kind of how I see that there's a difference. You can be a learning support teacher and you're doing good. You got your unit plans, your lesson plans, you're vibing with the kids. But the case management, what if you're disorganized? What if you don't connect all the different parties? What if you don't advocate for your kids? That to me, that's the next level. That's the case management. So we've talked a little bit about some history, some law, some guidance. Now let's look a little bit more closely at policy manuals from international schools around the world. What they say about the role of the case manager and a little bit of kind of examples for myself. So here's a little test we're going to do. Let's see how you do. True or false? A case manager's role could be to gather all the documentation from everyone for an SST type meeting, student study team, and facilitate this meeting. So think about that. True or false? I mean, isn't it the counselor's job to kind of run these kind of meetings, or maybe an admin's job, or the head of department, or is it the case manager's job? Boom. I say true. So it does depend on the school and all that, and you know, kind of the expectations. But often, to me, the learning support teacher / case manager, or just let's not get confusing. The case manager, it falls on them. It just makes sense for them to be holding it down and keeping all these pieces together because they know the student's case or just their whole you know, situation. Okay, here's another one. True or false? A case manager's role could be to lead the team to decide learning support eligibility and find the right program / services for a student. So think about that. Is that your job to, you know, figure out the service and the program? Is that a HOD's job? Is that the director of inclusion? Is that an admin's job? Or is that the case manager's job? All right, check it out. So I say true. So I got this from Next Frontier Inclusion, a practical guide for school leaders, which I read and thoroughly annotated in my first learning support coordinator job a few years ago. And they say this: decisions about learning support eligibility must be made by the team of professionals who work with the student, facilitated by the case manager. So basically, we are, you know, what do they say? Like the old song, the captain of the cruise ship. And yeah, so I mean, obviously, everything we do is team decisions, you know, with the parents, with the rest of the team on campus, but we are facilitating it. All right, true or false? The case manager knows academics, whereas the school psych, counselor, and or admin do behavior. I would say false. Here's a little excerpt from a policy manual from a well-known school in China. And I agree with this too. You know, they're saying if a student has learning support services, then the case manager is responsible for the behavior plan. And that's what I'm about too. I say if they don't have a case manager, then we can go through the referral process and student of concern process, and maybe the counselor is the point person. But once that person has already been through all that and has a case manager, and then they have behavior concerns, in my book, the way I roll, the way, you know, what I do is I work with the counselor a lot, and I work with the grade level coordinator, the homeroom teacher, all these people. But for me, I'm facilitating the behavior support plans and working with the parents and getting the home to school connections and all that stuff. All right, true or false? The case manager may work with other professionals, but ILP goals and academics are the main focus. What do you think? Is this true for you or false? So for me, I say false. You can see on this document that I got from a school. I'm trying to remember what school this was, but well, I'm probably not going to say it anyways. But yeah, so I liked what they said in point number 9. They say the case manager is making recommendations for and coordinating internal and external student support. So speech, OT, PT, counseling, all that stuff. And that's how I see it. Like we've been talking about. If I'm not doing it, then what if the counselor does it? But what if you have 2 counselors and one of them likes to do that, but the other one doesn't? And then I'm assuming both of them are doing it. You know, those type of things. We just don't want things to fall through the cracks. Okay, true or false? Understood.org is always a go-to, and you can leave it up to them to have a nice, succinct definition. True or false? So I don't know about y'all, but I find myself on the understood.org a lot when I'm looking up stuff. So boom. I like their definition. I say it's true. So basically, they're just saying a case manager is usually a special ed teacher or another member of the IEP team. The case manager is responsible for making sure your child's special education services and supports are in place. So I'm down with that. So I want to jump into kind of some of the big things I do on the day-to-day as a case manager and just kind of go over these things. I'm going to try to put these in the handout, all of them. So check the link in the WOVA for the handout, and there should be links to these. If I miss anything, feel free to email me, and I can shoot you a copy of these type of things. Here we go. So first thing, progress monitor the goals and the accommodations. So this is an example of this progress monitoring template I have for personal goals the students have, ILP goals. I have like 5, 6 tabs, and this is the accommodations. So every few months, we'll have all their accommodations listed. We'll see if they ask for it, you know, what classes, if they didn't, why not? Do they want to set a goal to use it? And should we keep it? So this is especially helpful for students that I don't see in the learning support class. So I can really, you know, remind them of their accommodations, set goals and stuff like that. Here's a similar progress monitoring for push-in classes. This is, you know, I mean, it's not total case management, but it's just another way to have data that show that the students are being successful at school. So this is one I use, and like, you know, I'll track the data. You know, the first quiz was August 27th. They got a 75, you know, like a 75%. On September 14th, they got a 50. Then on September 24th, they got a 54% on the test, which was a failing grade. Then we started an intervention. And then we see on the next test, they got an 86%, and we got comments and like plans and stuff like that. So this is one of the tools I use. Here's some stuff for behavior support. Here's a ticket to the week that I use. And basically, this is a pretty extensive one, but we figure out what the student has to do during the week and that they're not doing. So maybe they're not doing, you know, they're getting makeup time or detention and they're not going, or they have a daily tracker, or they have a to-do sheet that I'm talking about in a second. And then they'll earn things at home and at school based off how they do. And this is a big one for me, like as a case manager, like if the student's coming late, if they're not turning in work, like it's up to me to help, because they're not going to reach their academic goals if they're not doing the other stuff. So that's, you know, getting effort, getting parents involved and helping build their capacity is super important for me. Here's a math to-do sheet. So that every day the student would have to see me and fill this out. And then their parents would sign that they did it. And it's like a whole process that's super helpful. Here's a tracker for behavior. This is a daily tracker. So we figure out what behaviors we're looking at and then rate them, and then the kids will earn goals. I mean, if they reach their goals, they'll earn stuff. This one's a big one for me. This is a student information spreadsheet. So I keep track of everything surrounding my students on my caseload on a spreadsheet, like workbook for each student. So there's more than you can see here, but basically a lot of what I put in is I list every time they use an accommodation, I'll list it here. And then strategies that I do with them in class or with a teacher or something like that, I'll list it here. And this will help me to remember to do stuff. It helps me to remember to add things to the ILP when I update it. Strengths that I see I put here, challenges, both of those things can end up going to the ILP too, or I can just bring it up in meetings. Often when I have a meeting, I'll have this whole sheet up and I'll be referencing that. Notes, I just take notes, like if I had a parent meeting or I sent an email or something popped up. This is the whole thing I wrote a blog about, random things to follow up on. This really helps me as a case manager, because a lot of times you're like, yeah, I'll do that, blah, blah, blah. But for me, I'll put it like that on a Post-it, and then I'll put that in this box. And then every Saturday I have a reminder to check this box for the students. And I'll sometimes, I mean, I don't do it every week, but when I do sit down, I'll do one of these things and then I'll just cross it off. And that way I don't lose the stuff. And I think that makes me a stronger case manager for sure. But yeah, and then I have just observations and other stuff. So this is a key thing as a case manager, just keeping all the data in one place. You know, I might come up with another system someday, but this is what I have, and I've been using it for a long time. So accommodations, this is where I'm sharing the accommodations with the teachers. I'm giving presentations about different things to help, you know, maybe if the student has working memory and the teachers aren't familiar with that, or talking about dyslexia. I'm talking about common accommodations, having little PDs, doing it with the kids, doing it with the teachers, teaching students how to build their self-advocacy around accommodations, and just overall making sure that the accommodations are being implemented. I had a meeting recently as the head of the department, and it had to do with, you know, some students not getting accommodations with a specific person. And it just tripped me out that I had this same, because I went through my meeting notes and I had the same conversation 7 years ago, around the same time in October 2015. And I guess I was just happy that I advocated then and I did my research, and I was able to present the same argument to this teacher recently. Um, and then, yeah, that's kind of it. Like, you just basically have to advocate at times. Another thing I do is I have the first talk with students to find their needs and set goals and action plans. And this helps a lot, especially with kids on my caseload that I don't see regularly. So I can just meet with them and kind of touch base. And then usually we'll set up a little goal for the quarter, a personal goal, and then we'll set up action steps, and then I'll track these with them as we go throughout the year. So this is kind of just one of those things that keep things tight. Another thing I do is I try to motivate students on my caseload. So I'll pick the top student for each semester based off this criteria below, and I'll paint them a skateboard. And it's not totally altruistic. Basically, I like art. I like to make art. And I found in the past that I would never finish projects. And so finally what I did was I said, hey, I'm just going to make art for, you know, a student if they're doing well as like a reward. And it's going to force me to do this. Actually, now that I remember it, it was a girl that was struggling in chemistry. And I told her in June, I said, hey, if you pass chemistry, you know, like once the grades come out, if you got a passing grade, I'll paint you a skateboard. And she came to me in September and showed me her grade. And she's like, I passed. And I painted a skateboard. And I've been doing it every semester since. So yeah, that's one thing. Here's a kid here. I don't know if any of you guys have lived in Kuwait, but there's the Kuwait Towers. And I put some cool things on there. And that's the name of the school, I think. And there's our friend in the back doing his thing. All right, advocating, that's a key area that we're working with. Whether it be having multiple meetings with an English B or language B teacher that doesn't want a kid with dyslexia to use voice to text, or maybe I'm working with the parents of a 10th grader and the counselor, and we're working on this sheet that I developed to see if they should be full IB, you know, so that's a decision that, like, before I got to this school where I started doing this, we had tons of kids in the DP, the diploma program in the IB, 11th grade, and they were struggling big time. And I was just like, hey, how'd they get to this point? You know, who's managing the situation? And, you know, it's like I wasn't looking at anybody askance or askew or anything. It was just more like, we need to build systems because these students are not getting served. So doing stuff like this, and that's one of those things about, like I was talking about your evaluator before, like my boss didn't know necessarily that I was doing this, but it took a lot of time to develop. It took a lot of time to work with these kids, meet with the parents, meet with the counselor. We're making tough decisions. And that's just what I see my role as a case manager, collaborating with that counselor, working with the parents, and really just helping the students get the best decisions. And maybe I would just add that, you know, it's not all like pullout. You know, I'm not going to have my 6th graders in a pullout class and just think about that. I'm thinking about 12th grade. You know, I'm having conversations about my 6th graders and talking about their graduation paths. And if we modify now, what's going to happen in 5 years? And like, I think that's the role. Like, I think an English 6 teacher can just, or math, let's say math 6, they can be like, yeah, let's modify it. And that's not their job to think 6 years down the road necessarily. And maybe it's not the admin's job. They're like, oh yeah, you can modify, but the case manager needs to advocate for the right choice. And maybe we shouldn't modify at that point, for example. And then counselors, a lot of our jobs overlap, similar to social workers and nurses and stuff like that. But generally, I find that if a counselor has like a student on their caseload in the sense where like they see them once a week or every couple of weeks, usually it's more social emotional needs or anxiety. And while we collaborate, I feel that maybe the learning support case management may trump the counseling in some ways, just in the sense of like we are facilitators of the whole program. And I think that, just like I work with an SLP or an OT or a tutor or a therapist, I feel like a counselor is one more of those pieces that we're all tying together. And as I look at my Trump here, I don't know if Trump is the right word, but you know what I'm saying. Like we have to make decisions and we have to take everything in. Whereas the counselor is just thinking maybe they're not familiar with the content, they're not familiar with the criteria or the graduation standards, or maybe they know that, but you know what I'm saying? But me, I feel like it's our job as a case manager to know everything, keep everything moving to support our kids. All right, we're at the last stretch. So got a question for y'all again. I asked this question before. If it's not the learning support case manager holding all the pieces together, who can? To me, it boils down to the even more important question of, am I doing my job as a learning support teacher if my kid is getting Fs in all classes, if they're failing, except the push-in class I work in, and they're making progress on the intervention I'm doing or in their writing and reading goals? So am I doing my job if they come to my pullout class and they're making gains in their writing goal, and I go to their math class to push in and they're passing that class, but they're failing 6 other classes? Am I doing my job as a learning support teacher? Some people might say, yeah, well, what do you think? Like maybe you're like, hey, I can't do everything. I can't be watered down. But I have my answer and I live my answer every day. So I say, throw your answer in the chat and I will tell you what I think at some point soon, like today. And, perhaps you can shift my schema. I'm totally, malleable as the years go. Things are always changing. Okay, some final tips for, I don't know if tips is the right word, but just some final ideas. I think we need to have clearly defined ratios for caseload sizes. And, one of the things I brought in to some schools I worked at is the idea of weighting students. And that has to do with just like maybe a student on the monitor list might be like a 0.5 weight. And then a student with a behavior support plan and lots of ILP goals might be like a 1.5. And then your average kid in the learning support class might be a 1, those type of things, because you can't just look, or maybe like a DP student would be a 0.75 or a 1.25 or whatever it is. But you can't just say, oh, he has 15 kids and she has 15 kids, that's equal. Sometimes it's better to look at things a little bit more intricately. You should also have clearly defined roles in the policy manual. I've worked at schools where it's not defined. I've worked at schools where some people didn't think we used the term case manager, and some people did, and some documents said case manager, some didn't, like stuff like that. It needs to be very clear what the expectation is, or otherwise, there's room for falling through the cracks. You should do a little PD or outreach so everyone knows what we do, not just what we do in the classroom with the kids, like in the pullout, but also what do we do as a case manager? What are those expectations and how can we support all the other teachers? Have a good way of keeping track of all the students in the data. So I shared some of the things I use. I say whatever system you have, maybe you're using the Mario framework. I heard they have a good dashboard, or maybe you have a data analyst at your school that helps you make some nice spreadsheets and pivot tables and all that stuff. Whatever it is, you should have a good way of tracking it. And have a good and confidential, oops, I spelled that wrong, way to ease access of info for teachers. So, putting flags in the student information system, having registers that you can share, if they're GDPR compliant and confidential and all that. Whatever you do, I think just make access to the data as easy as possible for all the teachers. So my varied experiences and living in different countries and working in different systems have really changed my conception of what it means to be a learning support case manager. And it's kind of got me to the point where I'm at today and presenting this and kind of making this argument. And also just through all these experiences, I've learned how much I love being a case manager. Sometimes I think about what it'd be like just to teach content on a daily. And I always think that I would prefer to be a learning support teacher and a case manager just because there's something different every day, and every year and there's always something different. And to me, that's one of the reasons I love it. You can help students in such a different way. It's not just helping them in a certain criteria, but it's helping them just manage everything. And like, I think helping the parents and, like we had back to school meetings last week, and I had multiple parents that I was the kids case manager last year and I am this year. And, they're just telling me, oh, things, like, I guess basically like when they came to me last year, they were new to middle school and just parents were frantic at times or nervous, kids were crying, a lot was going on. And then to see the difference this year where they're like, hey, she's starting off 7th grade good. Thank you for everything you've done. This system worked. That's the type of stuff I really like to hear. And, getting to really know the parents and the kids and, just do all that. I love it. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the WOVA app. And, it's going to be there for 4 months. So you can kind of use that as a little bit of a social media, meet people on there, kind of chat, share ideas, get your schema changed and all that. Yeah, and then also hit me up. I'm going to put my contact information. So if you have any questions or anything like that, or if you want some of those things I've mentioned, feel free to hit me up. And there it is. So I've got my email or Gmail thing. I've got a website. This is a blog. And I also have a website with a ton of resources. And you can find that in the blog. And then I have a YouTube channel just similar to the blog, but I found that more people watch videos than read blogs. So I started shifting from the blogs to the YouTube. And so, yeah, you can see some more videos. So hopefully I'll see some of you guys at a future SENIA conference. I went to SENIA Europe a couple of weeks ago and in Bonn, and it was really good. I recommend it if you guys are in the area. We had people come from Africa and other places. And then I'm doing this, and so I'm sure I'm going to be doing more events as the years come. So hopefully we can chat and do it synchronously.